Okay, good afternoon. It's March. It's March 1st. And this is the first for me this month anyway, talking a lot about women because a week from today is International Women's Day. Did you know that? International. That started in 1978, and how that started was pretty simple. There were a bunch of women in Santa Rosa, California, who toasted themselves. They said to women, and the United Nations within a few years heard about this and said, here's to women. And they started International Women's Day, and now it's International Women's Month. So I've gone from President's Month and Black History Month to Women's Month. And this is something called the Women's World Games, or the Women's Olympics. The first time women organized the Olympics. And it was a big year for women in 1922 because of that, and because of the flappers, organized crime and prohibition, also big in 1922. Ku Klux Klan is going absolutely strong in 1922. The Lincoln Memorial is completed. How many of you have been to the Lincoln Memorial? Well, there it is, almost completed. It was completed 102 years ago. And technology is evolving. How would you like to have your radio and everybody listening with these big earphones to radio? But that's what it was in 1922. The Teapot Dome scandal emerges with Warren Harding and his corrupt cabinet members stealing oil. Fatty Arbuckle. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of Fatty Arbuckle. He was a comedian, and he was in the movies. And in 1921, he allegedly killed somebody, and he is acquitted. 3 times he was acquitted, but Hollywood needs to be cleaned up. And the beginning of Hollywood, cleaning up Hollywood, starts in 1922. Hitler is around in 1922, as is Mussolini. And back in the USSR, there you go, there are problems there as well. But I'm going to start with women's rights. And women, not all women in the United States in 1922, but a good many women had the right to vote. If you were Native American, well, you couldn't have the right to vote. And that wouldn't happen for decades later. If you were an African American woman, they made it very, very difficult for you to vote. Now, you can't see this all that well, but this is the 19th century, and this is women's rights. Women's rights denied. In the 1800s, American women had fewer rights than a male inmate in an insane asylum. Oh, gee, you can talk, I don't mind. Does that upset you, hearing that? Yeah. Well, there's more. Women cannot vote, serve on a jury. I don't know why anybody would ever want me to serve on a jury, because I have, over my journalism career, met the lowest rung of Harvard lawyers ever, and some lawyers who are in jail. Testify in court. They didn't believe a woman testifying in court. You couldn't hold public office as a woman. You couldn't attend college. You couldn't practice law. If a woman were married, it would be illegal for her to sign a contract, own or inherit property, keep or invest her own savings or earnings, or have automatic rights to her children. If something happened, they give it to the guy instead of the woman. Women were expected to center their lives around family and home, obey husbands in all matters. All matters. How many wives here would do that? No. No, you're emphatic about that too. Very emphatic. Not voice strong opinions in public. You can't tell people what you think. And also behaved in a refined and polite way. That was the women in the 19th century or the 1800s. By 1920, most but not all women in the United States got the right to vote. New Zealand enfranchises its female citizens in 1893, making it the first nation or territory to formally allow women to vote in national elections. At least 19 other countries allowed women to vote before the United States passed the 19th Amendment, and some women were able to vote in national elections. Now, in places like Utah and Idaho and Colorado, women were allowed to vote. These countries spread across Europe and Asia and included Russia, which gave the women the right to vote in 1917. But women struggled to gain equal rights, and the sports arena was the battlefield for women in 1922. Why? Well, it was not ladylike for girls to play sports in the 19th century. And how many of you growing up heard the same thing? It wasn't ladylike for you to play sports. How many of you played high school and played during gym? This is only for the women. Played basketball, but you can only go half court. Half court. And the reason why? Well, if you ran more than 48 feet, you would tire yourself out. And women weren't strong enough to do so. Which leads me to the next question. If women are the weaker sex, how come they outlive men?
How come they have the children too?
Yeah, yes, they have children also. I could not figure out how I would react to having a kid. A kid came out, good. That's the best for me. Anyway, but it didn't mean that women did not participate in sports in suburban New York City, especially here in Westchester. The wives of the Gilded Age millionaires wanted to play golf. And they did play golf down in Yonkers. Westchester was where the golf courses were in the late 1890s because that's where the trains ended up, in Westchester. They didn't end up in in Long Island. And I gave a talk on golf a number of years ago in New Jersey. They said, we had golf. I said, no, you didn't have the railroad. You got golf later. Anyway, there were the New York private clubs, like this one on Jackson Avenue down by Scarsdale and Yonkers. In 1895, John Reed's wife, Elizabeth, and several other women leased land on North Broadway in Yonkers and established the Sag Hill Country Club after St. Andrews slammed its doors on them. Sag Hill soon moved to a site overlooking the Hudson River, and by 1896 had 100 members, mostly women, but there were also men who joined this country club. And that's Sag Hill, which is long, long departed. Sunday golf. It's because of women, men were able to play baseball and golf in Westchester in the 1890s. Can play Sunday golf. Jury at Yonkers finds player not guilty of breaking the law. The jurors congratulated on their decision. Attorney and judge have a warm tilt. If two people are arguing, do you think that's warm and fuzzy and cuddly? New York Times did. Yonkers, New York, special to the New York Times, June 7th. In a courtroom crowded with prominent residents of this place, the question as to the right of man to play golf on Sunday in Yonkers was decided here today by the discharge of Benjamin Adams. Mr. Adams was arrested last Sunday for playing golf, playing the game. Let's do this again. He was arrested last Sunday for playing the game on the links of the Sag Hill Golf Club. He was tried before Judge Kellogg in a jury of 6 and was discharged, but only after a hard-fought legal battle during which there was an angry exchange of words by Judge Kellogg and Joseph F. Daly, one of the attorneys for the defendant. The decision was received joyfully by those who play baseball, because all of a sudden you could play baseball, you could play golf on Sunday in Westchester County before there were the blue laws, and you weren't supposed to be able to play. So women got a victory for the men. Meanwhile, over on Long Island, women did make a major advancement in golf.
What year was that?
That was 1896.
Thank you.
In 1894, the Amateur Golf Association was formed, and established a women's tournament. The first U.S. women's amateur took place in Jericho, Long Island. Anybody from Long Island here?
Yeah.
Where?
I was, Westbury.
Westbury, that's not far.
Jericho.
Jericho's
Near-
right there, nearby.
Yes.
So in 1895, women were being accepted in golf, but the Olympics, that was a totally different story. The Olympics were revived in 1896, and the organizers of the new Olympics Games decided, we don't want women. We don't want any women around. It was 1896, the first modern Olympic Games held in Athens, Greece. No women participants, absolutely none. An Olympic tennis player in 1900, the International Olympic Committee allowed some women to get involved. Now, you can't see this picture all that well. This woman is wearing, from neck down, a dress. She is wearing a dress and she's wearing a hat. I'm surprised that they didn't have a mask in front of her too, but that was a woman's tennis player. Women did take part in the 1900 Olympic Games in Paris, and Lottie Cooper of Britain became the first female Olympic champion in tennis. Women were allowed to participate in the games, kind of, sort of, but not really. The games for women were expanded to include archery, and then in 1912, women did also participate in individual sports such as aquatics and gymnastics. But there were no team competitions for women. And this is the guy who revitalized the Olympics, Baron Pierre de Coubertin. And he hated women in the Olympics. Absolutely hated women in the Olympics. Didn't want them, thought it was unladylike, thought there'd be something wrong with a woman if she competed in sports. De Coubertin was the International Olympic Committee president, and he tried to marginalize women's sports. After the 1912 Stockholm Games, he and many of the other International Olympic Committee colleagues believed that an Olympiad with females would be impractical, uninteresting, unaesthetic, and improper. So who said OG? What, you don't believe with the Baron there? Hard to believe, but that's what was going on. So they were going to kick out women in 1916, except they got derailed by World War I, so there were no Olympics in 1916. And the morality of the Baron. De Coubertin argued that because of biological reasons, sports were too violent for women. Golf is too violent for women? Golf? All you do is that, and you walk. Furthermore, he argued that women's athletic exhibitions would erode society's morals by arousing the passions of male spectators. In other words, if a man watching a woman in a full dress playing tennis might get aroused and might do something, even though the woman is clad from neck down to toe. But that was the Olympics. In 1914, the IOC General Session made it clear, no women to participate in track and field. But as for before, participating in fencing and swimming is okay. World War I started in 1914, the continent is at war, so there is no 1916 Olympics. And this is Alice Millier, and she is a rower from France. And she is getting increasingly unhappy with everybody from the International Olympic Committee, and she decides to do something once World War I is done. She was born in France in 1894. She was a rower. She joined the sport club of Feminin Sport Club. Before the First World War, she became its president in 1915. And she wanted to compete in the rowing competition in 1916. But as I said, the war started and there's no Olympics in 1916. But what the war meant was the men were off to fight and the women had to take responsibilities elsewhere. And the women would provide or would prove to be more than capable and would be up to the challenge in not only sports but industry. And this is a munitions factory in England during World War I. Notice there are no men in that picture. It's all women. And women are making the ammunition for England for World War I. Well, the company that owned the munitions plant said, you know, the women need some relaxation. So we'll let them use the football pitch or the soccer pitch. The company is called Dick Kerr and Company. Preston-based England locomotive and tram car manufacturer that had converted to munitions production at the outbreak of World War I in 1914. The female workers who replaced the men who went off to war at the business were allowed to play soccer on the facility's grounds, and they showed an ability to play the game. Dick Kerr's ladies beat the rival factory, Arundo Courthart, 4-0 on Christmas Day. 10,000 people watching at Preston's North End Deepdale Stadium. By 1920, after the war, the day after Christmas, Boxing Day, 53,000 people watched Dick Kerr's ladies beat St. Helens ladies 4-0. What do you think the men thought about when they heard that there were 53,000 people watching women playing soccer? What do you think? It's wonderful, but what do you think the men are thinking? Gotta get rid of this. We can't keep this. Women are popular, playing sports, they're arousing guys, or whatever. They look like a prison gang, don't they? That was their uniform. And this right here, Lily Parr, she was the best player, best women's soccer player. And during the games, she would go to the sidelines and smoke. And she'd curse like a sailor. But she may have been the best soccer player ever. After the war, Dick Kerr's ladies played matches to raise money for the National Association of Discharged and Disabled Soldiers and Sailors, winning most of their games. And that is Lily Parr. She scored all the goals. She was the greatest player of her time. 1921, the soccer team reached the peak of its popularity. She, Lily Parr, was the star, and they drew tens of thousands of people to more than 60 games that year. What do you think the men were thinking when they saw all these people watching women's soccer? Think they liked it? No, didn't like it at all. Parr started her Dick Kerr's career at the age of 14 during the war. She scored 43 goals the first season. The team played 828 matches. They won 758, drew 46 or tied 46, lost 24. They scored more than 3,500 goals during that time, and Lily Parr got about 1,000 of them. But England decided this is it. We've had enough. We've had enough of these women. We got to put the women back in their place. Now, this group had a North American tour scheduled for 1922, and they would go on the tour. On December 5th, 1921, the Football Association, which was the governing body of football or soccer, had enough of women playing the game. The FA told women to play soccer on a recreational level. The FA would not supply referees to officiate women's matches or even allow them in the big stadiums anymore. Why? Because it wasn't ladylike. Just look at them. They're not ladylike, are they? That's what they thought. The FA also concluded that women should not be playing football or soccer because it was quite unsuitable for females and ought not to be encouraged. How many of you have granddaughters or great-granddaughters? I have granddaughters. My granddaughters climb all over the place in playgrounds, and they don't take a back seat to boys. Maybe when I was growing up in the mid-1960s that happened. Doesn't happen today. Dick Kerr ladies toured North America in 1922 following the English ban. They were banned on their arrival in Canada because it was still an English colony, Canada, even though it was a country. And they had strong ties to England. So they couldn't play in Canada in 1922. They did manage to play 9 games in the United States, and they would disappear. The men won. The FA, they found, the English FA found doctors who said that soccer posed a serious physical threat to women. The men running the FA barred women from playing at the highest level. Well, you know, de Coubertin's view was unacceptable. 1919, Milliet asked Olympic officials to let women compete in track and field at the 1920 Olympics at Antwerp in Belgium. De Coubertin, the founder of the modern Olympics and the president of the International Olympic Committee, was strongly opposed. Milliet had enough of de Coubertin, and it was time to act. The war was over, and there was not a sufficient excuse for not allowing women to compete in track and field. And this is the 1920 Antwerp, Belgium Olympics, and de Coubertin does not want any women there. Alice Milliet, 1920, the Olympic Games held for the first time in 8 years. Very few opportunities for women. 65 women were around, and they competed in swimming, diving, and figure skating. But Alice Milliet was not allowed to compete in the 1920 Olympics because there was no competition open to her. So she decided to do something about it. And like I said, it is International Women's Month. Next Friday is International Women's Day, so this is a perfect story for International Women's Month. And there she is, Alice Milliet. She's the founder and president of the Fédération Sportive Féminine Internationale. It started operations in Paris in October 1921. Earlier that year, she organized the 1921 Women's Olympiad, the first international women's sports event. It was a multi-day sports event that was held in Monte Carlo between March 21st and 31st. It was a response to the International Olympic Committee's decision to kick the women out of the 1924 Olympics. You're not coming. You're gone in 1924. We want no part of you in 1924. Well, the first women's international sports event, that would be in 1921, 10 events, some running events, 60 meters, 250 meters, 800 meters, 4 by 75 meters relay, 4 by 175 meters relay, and hurdling, 65 meters, high jump, long jump, standing long jump, exhibition only, javelin, and shot put. There were also exhibitions in basketball, gymnastics, push ball, and rhythmic gymnastics. 5 nations were there. It was a success, and it would be a stepping stone to the first ever Olympics for women only. And that's what it is, 1922, the Women's Olympiad. Yes?
These were only white women though, right?
At the time, yeah, from Europe. From Europe at the time. In fact, the first African Americans from the United States to compete, Tidey Pickens and Louise Stokes, made the 1932 Olympic team, track and field, but because of Jim Crow and racism, were not allowed to compete. But they did compete in 1936 at the Berlin Olympics. But anyway, here they go. The Women's Olympiad. That was the first regular international women's games and the first track and field competitions for women. The tournament was held on one day, August 20th in Paris. 77 participants from 5 countries: Czechoslovakia, France, Great Britain, Switzerland, and the United States. Milliet's event captured attention in Paris, and about 20,000 people came out to see the women perform. It was another successful presentation by Milliet, and even the New York Times gave it praise. And this is what it was: American Girl record breakers and Olympic scorers. U.S. girls smashed records in Paris. First time ever an Olympics just for women. Yeah, and with the hope that, hey, we'll show you and you get us back in the Olympics in 1924. The New York Times said of the Olympics of 1922, the 1922 Women's Olympics was notable for the development of women athletes in all branches of competition fitting to their sex. Remarkable progress was made by them, and almost overnight, they assumed a place of great prominence in the world of athletics. Now, Alice Milliere was hoping to convince Olympic officials to let women compete in track and field on equal footing with men. The women's movement was not limited to sports games. Flappers. Any of you have mothers or aunts or sisters who were flappers? Nobody had any relatives that made bathtub gin? See, I've heard these stories from people about their mothers and their grandmothers who taught them in Charleston, which would come later, or the stories about women wearing high heels and short skirts and smoking and drinking because women felt liberated. And 1922, of course, is the Olympics, and this is Olive Thomas, the flapper. She had an unfortunate end to her life. She died very young. Seemed like a lot of Hollywood starlets died very young back then. The first appearance of the flapper style in the United States came from the popular 1920 Francis Marion film, The Flapper, starring Olive Thomas. She starred in a similar role in 1917, though it was not until The Flapper that the term was used. In the United States, popular contempt for prohibition was a factor in the rise of the flapper. With legal saloons and cabarets closed, back alley speakeasies became prolific and popular. The discrepancy between law-abiding, religious-based temperance movement and the consumption of alcohol led to widespread disdain for authority. In 1922, a small circulation magazine, The Flapper, was published in Chicago, and it celebrated the flapper's appeal. On the opening page of the first issue, it proudly declared, "Flappers break with traditional values. Women are going their separate ways from where their mothers were or their grandmothers were. They were going to have some fun. That's what they wanted to do." And there is an issue of the flapper and the hat, the outfit. Thanksgiving. That's the Thanksgiving issue of the flapper. It wasn't cheap. 20 cents a copy back then. That wasn't cheap at all. Unlike their mothers and grandmothers, flappers tended to go to high school and even college. Flappers went to work as well. How many of your mothers went to college? Any? College. Any of your mothers go to college? I had one woman a few weeks ago talking about the flappers. She said her mother went to Erasmus High School in Brooklyn and then went to Brooklyn College, and she was the black sheep of the family. She was the one that they were least proud of because she got an education. According to a report, some banks across the United States started to regulate the dress and deportment of young female employees who were considered flappers. The anti-flapper code soon spread to the Federal Reserve, where female employees were firmly told that there was no time for them to beautify themselves during office hours. In other words, if you came in a burlap sack, we'd be very happy if that's the way you dressed. And there's the flappers. And they were bad girls, according to educators, parents, grandparents, clergy. They were really bad girls. Flappers set the stage for a much more liberated view of women's sexuality, in that they made it so women would no longer be considered impure, immoral, or dangerous for engaging in casual, consensual sexual activities. The flappers were a great source of word to parents and to educators, physicians, clergymen. Sounds like the Olympic guys, doesn't it? Sounds just like the guys in the Olympics. Why women shouldn't be around, who feared that sports and higher education would be ruinous. How many of you went to college here? How many of you who went to college think that you ruined society by getting an education? Anybody? Or did you help society? You helped society. But that was the attitude. Women should be seen, not heard, should be in the kitchen, and shouldn't have any opinions, nothing, nothing. Flappers went to speakeasies, which was a place where they drank alcohol provided by gangsters. And you better know the password to get in. Even Harpo Marx knew the password, swordfish, and he was able to get in. When Prohibition took effect on January 17, 1920, many thousands of formerly legal saloons across the country catering to men only closed down. People wanted to drink, but they had to buy liquor from licensed druggists for medicinal purposes and clergymen for religious purposes, or illegal sellers known as bootleggers. Another option, go into one of these private unlicensed bar rooms, nicknamed speakeasies, for how low you had to speak the password to gain entry, as so you wouldn't be heard by law enforcement. Who were there anyway? They were doing the same thing. They were drinking. Speakeasies were Prohibition's worst secret. Prohibition was difficult to enforce. The demand for alcohol was outweighing the demand for sobriety. People found clever ways to evade Prohibition agents. They carried hip flasks, hollowed canes, false books, and the like. Neither federal nor local authorities would commit resources necessary to enforce the Volstead Act. In general, Prohibition was enforced in much more strongly areas where the people were sympathetic to the legislation, mainly rural areas in small towns and not really in the big city. Apparently in Manhattan, the estimates were there were at least 50,000 speakeasies in Manhattan. Now, before you think they were all plush places, a speakeasy could be somebody's apartment where bathtub gin was made. And you went there and had some gin, and hopefully you didn't get poisoned, because poisoning was a big deal in those days. There is the speakeasy.
Why do they call it?
There were.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
Why do they call it a speakeasy?
Because when you walked in and gave the password, gave the password. And then you went in, and of course you danced. There was all kind of music, and the cops were there to make sure it wasn't raided, because they were enjoying the same thing too. I'll give you a story. When I was 18 years old, I worked at the Rockland County Drive-In movie. Anybody from Rockland County here? Nobody? Well, the Rockland County Drive-In was on Route 59. And we had a projectionist who was about 74, 75 years old at the time by the name of Albert Morris. And I was told he was a bootlegger during the period right after he was a flyer in World War I. He knew Rickenbacker, among others. He came back to Rockland County. He was a British citizen, Canadian citizen, and he lived in Spring Valley. And because he was a British Canadian citizen, trains used to come down from Montreal to Suffern. And he would pick up the hooch on the train, bring it back to his house, load it in the bathtub, and he would water it down, and then he would go back to Suffern and send it out west. So I was 18, and everybody knew I was going to go into journalism there. They said, you should go interview Al. Okay. I go up, talk to Al, and I said, so I hear that you transported the liquor. Who told you? Al, it's 41 years since Prohibition ended. What'd you do? Well, I went to Suffern, brought the stuff back, watered it down, and put it back on the train going west. I said, who sent it to you from Montreal? I don't know. Well, where'd it go? Did it go Capone and those people, George Ramos, in Chicago? I don't know. Who paid you? I forgot. I said, Al, this is 1974. Prohibition was over 41 years ago. But he wouldn't give it up. He wouldn't give up the secrets. And there were a lot of secrets because you were supposed to keep it secret. And he was still keeping it secret 41 years later. Thousands of people died each year from drinking cheap moonshine tainted with toxins. And revenue shrank from many states that had previously relied on liquor taxes to fund roads and schools and other public benefits. From New York to Chicago to Los Angeles, or Los Angeles, Chicago to New York, organized crime syndicates supplied speakeasies and underground establishments with large quantities of beer and liquor. These complex bootlegging operations used rivers, waterways to smuggle alcohol across state lines. Mobsters were seemingly 3 steps ahead of, or 3 miles ahead by boat of international waters. That's, I'm talking about Canadian waters. Guys got stuff. It was loaded in Canada. onto the boat. They were called speed boats. They were faster than the Coast Guard boats. They were in international waters. They sped in, dropped the stuff off, and sped out. And they too were head of law enforcement. Some mobsters, like Arnold Rothstein, who had a fleet of ships bringing liquor in from Europe. He had a fleet of ships. They knew about it too. He became incredibly rich from bootlegging. So this is America, 1922, another flapper. The Roaring Twenties did not get off to a good start in America. At the conclusion of World War I, the U.S. found itself in a bleak position. The federal debt had exploded because of wartime expenditures, and annual consumer price inflation rates had jumped well above 20% by the end of the war. There was also the Spanish flu pandemic, which was over by 1922. But it started in the spring of 1918, returned in waves into 1920. 675,000 Americans killed, including 2 of my great uncles. And the family said they weren't killed by the flu, they were poisoned by lovers, to make it sound more romantic or sinister, but they died of the Spanish flu. And a large fraction of the deaths were people of working age, so resulting in economic dislocation. The unemployment peak was at, in 1921 at 11.7%. And there was a conference in Washington on unemployment. But the thing is, it disappeared rather quickly, the recession in 1921 and 22. President Woodrow Wilson's term of office ended on March 4th, 1921. His slow response to the Depression started in 1920. Well, hell, he was an invalid. He didn't know what was going on. His wife, Edith, was running the country. He was an invalid, incapable of doing anything. His wife ran the country. That's probably the slow response to the Depression. It was criticized by those in the Republican Party. Warren Harding, who was sworn in as President of the United States March 4th, 1921, convened the President's Conference on Unemployment at the instigation of the Commerce Secretary Herbert Hoover as a result of rising unemployment during the recession. This is the first depression of the 1920s. There were 2. The one in 1929 brought down the country. About 300 members of industry, banking, and labor were called together in September 1921 to discuss the problem of unemployment. Hoover organized the Economic Conference and the Committee on Unemployment. The committee established a branch in every state having substantial unemployment, along with sub-branches in local communities and mayor's emergency committees in 31 cities. The committees contributed to relief to the unemployed and also organized collaboration between local and federal governments. Harding signed the emergency tariff in 1921 and the Fordney-McCumber tariff. Secretary of Treasury Andrew Mellon also successfully pushed for lower income tax rates, especially for the very rich, to help the recovery. Officially, the recession or depression lasted only from January 1920 to July 1921, or 18 months. That didn't mean that Americans were basking in riches in 1922. But the economic downturn reversed itself, more jobs opened up, but farmers were still suffering. The farmers had been in a depression since 1920 and couldn't get out of it. They overproduced for the war, the prices went down, and they had mortgages. It was a really tough time for the farmers. Oh, there was one other problem in America. Racism, anti-immigrant sentiments were raging. This is a KKK rally near Los Angeles. The New York World, a newspaper back then, gets a Pulitzer Prize for public service for its stories exposing the Ku Klux Klan operations. Immigration and prohibition was causing cultural conflict, and modernization helped resuscitate the Ku Klux Klan. The original Ku Klux Klan was violent, racist, born in the post-Civil War South. The modern Klan was driven by somewhat different concerns. The group was anti-immigration, anti-union, anti-Catholics, anti-Jews, and strongly in favor of prohibition, which was put in place in 1919 with the 18th Amendment. Many white, lower class Protestant Americans in the North and the Midwest were fearful that immigrants were changing traditional American culture, and they responded with anti-Catholicism and anti-Semitism. Meanwhile, the Lincoln Memorial is dedicated, and 17 years later, there would be Marian Anderson singing in front of the Lincoln Memorial. But this was also basically, well, whites only, at best. President William Howard Taft signed the bill to create the memorial to Abraham Lincoln in February 1911. When the Lincoln Memorial was dedicated on November 30th, now Chief Justice Taft officiated the ceremony. Seating was segregated, and the ceremony's only black speaker was forced to drastically revise his speech to avoid spreading propaganda. They were worried. Lincoln at this point is dead almost, 60 years? And the stories were about the Emancipation Proclamation, and yet this is a segregated event. Robert Todd Lincoln, the president's only surviving son, attended the ceremony, which featured speeches from Taft and Harding, and Robert Russell Morton, principal of the Tuskegee Institute, a historically black school in Alabama. So Warren G. Harding was elected in 1920.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
It was restricted
Yeah.
when he spoke, the guy from Tuskegee,
Yeah. Yeah.
to an all-white audience.
Yeah. Yeah. It was Washington, 1920s. Warren G. Harding's return to normalcy. Well, that's what he campaigned on in 1920. But what was the normalcy in 1922? Prohibition wasn't normal. Taking the right to drink from somebody. The economy was rebounding slightly, and Harding was no friend to the farmers and didn't want to help them out. Harding signed off on limiting immigration in 1921, cut taxes on the rich thanks to his Secretary of State, Andrew Mellon. It's called supply-side economics, and it was pushed by Ronald Reagan. It was pushed by Jack Kemp. Doesn't work. Doesn't work. Anyway, Harding supported Congressman Leonidas Dyer's federal anti-lynching bill. It failed to pass. An anti-lynching bill in 1922 failed to pass. Harding's America returned to normalcy. Well, radio wasn't normal, and yet you had radio on in 1922. Here he is listening to radio. Harding embraced technology. The use of electricity became increasingly common. Mass production of motorized vehicles stimulated other industries as well, such as highway construction, rubber, steel, and building, as hotels were erected to accommodate tourists venturing on the roads. The economic boost helped bring the nation out of the recession. To improve and expand the nation's highway system, Harding signed the Federal Highway Act of 1921. Harding also wished to promote aviation, convening a national convention on commercial aviation, discussions focused on safety matters, inspection of airplanes, licensing of pilots. You did not have to have a license to be a pilot in 1922. On February 8th, Harding installed the first radio in the White House, and that got national attention. And here is Harding on radio. On June 14th, Warren G. Harding became the first president to have his voice transmitted by radio. Harding addressed the crowd at a dedication in Baltimore for a memorial to Francis Scott Key, who wrote the lyrics for the Star-Spangled Banner. Harding was a technology buff. He installed the radio when there were just 28 stations in operation. By the end of the year, there were 500 radio stations around the United States. And since the government didn't regulate the industry, broadcasters fought over frequency and call letters. The first radio star was this guy, You know who he is? Ed Wynn. Nobody knows who Ed Wynn. I knew who Ed
He was
Wynn
a
was.
comedian.
He was a comedian.
Right.
Was one of the first people to ever have his own TV show in 1946 in Los Angeles. The Perfect Fool, Ed Wynn. He is the first big name who becomes a radio star. It is February 19th. Ed Wynn becomes the first big vaudeville star to join radio. The first broadcast is Wynn's The Perfect Fool, and the station is WJZ, New York. It's also the first time in the world that a radio show is broadcast before a studio audience. On March 10th, in the United States, Variety magazine prints its front page headline, Radio Sweeping the Country. 1 million sets in use, and they weren't cheap. They averaged about $89 a radio set. WOR, anybody listens to WOR still today? Made its debut in 1922. WWL in New Orleans, same thing. WLW in Cincinnati made its debut. Brazil, France, and Russia have their first commercial radio stations. Teapot Dome oil field, and the scandal breaks in 1922. In 1920, President Woodrow Wilson, or Edith Wilson, set aside 3 tracts of oil-rich land to be used in national emergencies. The oil fields were located in Elks Hill in Buena Vista, California, and Teapot Dome, Wyoming. Wilson transferred the control of the oil fields from the Secretary of the Interior to the Secretary of the Navy, who cataloged them as Naval Oil Reserve number 1, 2, and 3. Following the administration of Warren G. Harding, the Secretary, or under the administration of Warren G. Harding, Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall advised the President to return the control of the land to his department following the conversation he had with the Secretary of the Navy, Edwin Denby. On May 21st, 1921, Harding signed Executive Order 3474, transferring control of the naval oil reserves from the Secretary of the Navy to the Secretary of the Interior. And here's Albert Fall being sworn in. 11 months later, there were rumors of a shady deal after local Wyoming oilmen noticed trucks with the Sinclair logo hauling oil field equipment up to the Teapot Dome. Why would you leave your logo on there? Why? They did. The Wall Street Journal broke the news about the deal in an April 14th article. The paper had reported an unprecedented secret agreement which Fall would do the leasing without competitive bidding for the Teapot Dome. The very next day, Wyoming Democratic Senator John Kendrick introduced a resolution to open Senate investigation in the dealings. There was a basic question that needed to be answered. How did Interior Secretary Albert Fall get rich so quickly? There's the Wyoming Senator. He received a flurry of correspondence, did Kendrick, from constituents informing him of backroom deals that had resulted in the private leasing of the Teapot Dome land tract to Mammoth Oil Company, owned by the oil tycoon Harry F. Sinclair, whose gas stations are still out there today. Earlier, the Elk Hills tract had been leased to Edward L. Doman. He is the owner of the Pan American Petroleum and Transport Company. Another picture of Fall. Both leases provided terms very favorable to the oil companies, and Teapot Dome lease was made with no competitive bidding. Neither the public nor Congress had been informed of the leases beforehand, and a request for more information by Senator Kendrick was initially denied by Fall's Interior Department. Fall was contending with another oil man and Harding supporter, Colonel James G. Darden, who claimed that he had first dibs on the Teapot Dome site before Fall leased it to Sinclair. In a desperate move, Fall convinced a reluctant President Warren Harding to dispatch the U.S. Marines to halt Darden's efforts to drill at the site. Where's Harding? Where's Harding in all this? Well, the publishers of the Denver Post got wind of the confrontation, and they publicized the incident and used threats of additional withering editorials about Teapot Dome to blackmail Sinclair to paying $1 million, or about $18 million today to them and to another oil man who felt cheated by the Teapot Dome lease. So there was blackmail here. Harding, wary of bad press, may have played a part in pressuring Sinclair to pay off the Denver Post publishers in the oil man. How many of you enjoy movies with blood, sex, gore, dirty words? No. Romance? Well, this is the very corrupt Postmaster General of the United States, Will Hayes. He ran Harding's campaign in 1920, but he decides he's going to get out of Dodge to clean up the movie industry. Will Hayes resigned his cabinet position as the United States Postmaster General on January 14th. He became the chairman of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America shortly after the organization's founding. And his big thing to clean up was Fatty Arbuckle and the death of Virginia Rapet. Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle was accused of the rape and murder of model and actress Virginia Rapet, and there were calls by religious groups for federal censorship of movies. Movies were not protected by freedom of speech, according to the Supreme Court in 1950. Hiring Hayes was a public relations ploy, and much was made of Hayes' conservative credentials, which included his roles as a Presbyterian deacon and the past chairman of the Republican Party. Less than a week after his arrest in 1921, Arbuckle's films had been pulled from every screen in America. Arbuckle was accused of having caused Rapet's death and tried 3 times. He was acquitted 3 times, the final time on April 12th. 1 week later, Will Hayes banned Fatty Arbuckle from appearing on screen. Hayes would change his mind about 8 months later, but the damage was done. Hayes was now the movie studio's morality enforcer, although his main job wasn't that. It was to pitch individual state censors and their boards not to edit films that much because the studios had to pay for the editing. The midterm election in 1922, Harding and the Republicans followed through on many of their campaign promises, but some of the fulfilled pledges, like cutting taxes for the rich, didn't appeal to the electorate. The economy had not returned to normalcy, unemployment 11%, and organized labor was angry over the outcome of strikes, or many strikes over the past few years. In the elections, the Republicans suffered major losses in both the House and the Senate. Okay, I don't know what you know about Warren G. Harding. Do you know anything about Warren G. Harding? He had an illegitimate child. He was blackmailed by a lover and paid off by the Republican committee led by Hayes in 1920. But Warren G. Harding, who gave a speech in 1921 on getting blacks equal rights, also supported a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Did you know that? 1922, 102 years ago, Warren G. Harding said that the Jews should have their own homeland in Palestine. It is September 21st, a resolution signed by Warren G. Harding to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine per the 1917 Balfour Declaration. Harding declared, "It is impossible for one who studied at all the service of the Hebrew people to avoid the faith that they would one day be restored to their historic home and there enter a new and yet greater phase of contribution to the advancement of humanity." The passage of the resolution was crucial in legitimizing Zionism with the American Jewish community, especially since it had the stamp of approval from the non-Jewish world. So did you know anything about that?
I didn't know about Harding. I knew about Balfour.
You knew about Balfour, but nobody knows about Harding.
That's right.
Now you know. Now you know. Over there, it's over there. The First World War and subsequent peace settlements gave rise to new ambitions, rivalries, and tensions. People had high expectations that the post-war peace settlement would create a new world order and ensure the slaughter of the First World War would never be repeated. And here are the four guys who carve up Europe. Woodrow Wilson, before his stroke, obviously. Orlando from Italy, and David Lloyd George from England, and Clemenceau from France. They were the big four. The big four carved up Europe, and they wanted to make sure that Germany was severely punished. That surrender wasn't enough. And old German soldiers, the Austrian Adolf Hitler, they were infuriated with the settlement. That's why Hitler hated Jews. During World War I, between 1914 and 18, Adolf Hitler was a soldier in the German army. At the end of the war, he and many other Germans like him couldn't get over the defeat of the German Empire. The German Army Command spread the myth, the big lie, that the army had not lost on the battlefield, but they had been betrayed. Well, who betrayed them? Who betrayed them? By a stab in the back, as it was called at the time, Hitler bought into the myth, the lie, Jews and communists had betrayed the country and brought a left-wing government to power that wanted to throw in the towel. 1919 is where you get your first indication that Hitler hated Jews. He penned a letter to a colleague that became known as the Gremlich letter. It was all about how horrible the Jews were. And that is a picture of the Nazi Party in 1922. By blaming the Jews for the defeat, Hitler created a stereotypical enemy. According to the Austrian Citizen, Hitler expelling the Jews was the solution to all problems in Germany. Hitler, his rise starts in February 1920. February 24th, Hitler delivered the Nazi platform, party platform speech to a large crowd in Munich, an event that is regarded as the foundation of Nazism. The German Workers' Party had already existed. Hitler, who was a great orator, laid out a 25-point platform. His idea, central idea, strengthened German citizenship by excluding and controlling Jewish people and others deemed to be non-German, like him. He wasn't German, he was Austrian. Some Germans began to support Hitler, even though Hitler, as an Australian citizen, would have been thrown out of Germany under what he was planning. The beginnings of Hitler. Hitler established himself as the absolute Führer, or leader of the NSDAP, by 1921, and he is using former military conflicts, former military colleagues, Hermann Göring and the army captain Ernest Röhm, as he's growing the party. In a New York Times profile of Hitler on November 21st, the Times gave its readers first glimpse of Hitler in the profile. The writer covering Hitler describes Hitler's ability to work a crowd into a fever pitch. Oh yeah, he's condemning Jews. Meanwhile, Mussolini is consolidating power. The fascists were initially an urban phenomenon motivated primarily by nationalism. They desired revenge against the socialists and others who had not supported Italy's participation in the Great War. Even before the war's end, veterans would later become fascists, calling for the expatriation of Italy's eternal enemies, whom they held responsible for Italy's crushing defeat to the Austria-Hungary and German forces in the battle of 1917 of Caporetto. The fascist attacks against socialists, according to Benito Mussolini, were like assaults on an Austrian trench. He declared, "This is heroism. This violence, of which I approve and I exalt, this is the violence of fascism." And this is Mussolini's Italy. During the high tide of Squadrissimo, members of the Fasci Italian di Combattimento movement, who would form the official fascist party, mobilized tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of Italian men who carried out acts of brutal violence within their own communities, neighboring cities, towns, villages, and hamlets. Even before the war's end, the veterans who would later become fascists, calling for the expiration of Italy's internal enemies, and they said they were responsible for bad things. Marxists and socialists. In Po Valley, the socialists established a virtual state within the state, winning control of municipal government, labor exchanges, peasant leagues, unions. Socialists also founded cooperatives, cultural circles, taverns, sporting clubs. Such working-class organizations exercised their power largely through legal means, elections, boycotts, strikes, demonstrations, which nonetheless often led to clashes with police, with injuries and deaths on both sides. Political culture and the social order had been radically altered, with rough peasants and workers out occupying the halls of power and red flags from town halls. For landowners, life in this new red state meant higher wages, higher taxes, reduced profits, lost managerial authority, deteriorating private property rights, and the threat of social revolution. And there's Mussolini's Italy, Karl Marx there. Displays of the red flags, busts of Karl Marx, international slogans offended national and patriotic middle-class sentiments. Conservatives denounced the Red Terror and atrocities of this period. The landowners and middle classes were in little danger. They were not physically assaulted, nor were their homes, offices, or private property damaged or destroyed. In the provincial centers, fascist violence was initially used to break the socialist hold on the local administration and labor organizations. Fascists interrupted meetings, beat elected officials, made it impossible for the local government to work. Socialists in particular were intimidated, threatened, and even beaten until they were resigned. Consequences for the Socialist Party, which was entirely unprepared to counter organized parliamentary violence, were disastrous. Socialist Party. The Mussolini's Italy in the province of Bologna, one of the reddest provinces in the entire Po Valley, where the Italian Socialist Party received 3/4 of the vote. 1919, the fascists demonstrated, demolished the Socialist Party in a matter of months. Between March and May 1921, the squads destroyed dozens of newspaper offices, chambers of labor, peasants' leagues, cooperatives, and social clubs. Throughout northern and central Italy, fascists replicated this feat. Having conquered major provincial centers, the fascists spread out into small towns and hamlets. Major cities provided launching points for attacking other cities. Having consolidated power in these places, the squads then moved into peripheral areas. And there is Mussolini again. After rooting socialists out of the community, fascists commonly held a public ceremony inaugurating the new fascio. As fascists penetrated small rural communities, it became a mass movement without precedent in Italian history. Before this takeoff in provincial fascism, the fascists initially were an urban phenomenon motivated primarily by nationalism. They desired revenge against the socialists and others who had not supported the participation in the Great War. After failing in the 1919 elections, Mussolini entered Parliament in 1921 as a right-wing member. The fascisti formed armed squads terrorizing Mussolini's former socialist colleagues. The government seldom interfered. In return for the support of a group of individuals and agrarians, Mussolini gave his approval to strike-breaking and he abandoned revolutionary agitation and marched on the rule. Gathering of 30,000 black shirts succeeded on the March on Rome, October 28th. That forced the Prime Minister, Luigi Factor, to resign, inserting a fascist government. Didn't take very long. On October 31st, King Victor Emmanuel III formally appoints Mussolini Prime Minister. On November 16th, his first speech to the Chamber of Deputies, Mussolini declared, "I could have shut down Parliament and set up a government exclusively of fascists. I could have, but at least at this early stage, I have not wanted to." Meanwhile, Stalin and Lenin in the USSR. On December 30th, in post-revolutionary Russia, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics is established, comprising of the Confederation of Russian, Belarusian, Ukraine, and Trans-Caucasian Federation. Soviet Union had its origins in the Russian Revolution in 1917. Radical leftist revolutionaries overthrew Russia's Tsar Nicholas II, ending centuries of Romanov rule. The Bolsheviks established a socialist state in the territory that was once the Russian Empire, back in the USSR. A long and bloody civil war followed. The Red Army, backed by the Bolshevik government, defeated the White Army, which represented a large group of loosely allied forces, including monarchists, capitalists, and supporters and other forms of socialism. In the period known as the Red Terror, Bolshevik secret police carried out a campaign of mass executions against the supporters of the Tsarist regime and against Russia's upper class. Back in the USSR, this is St. Petersburg, Russia. The newly established Communist Party, led by the Marxist revolutionary Vladimir Lenin, to control the government. Lenin began to harbor serious doubts about one of the members of his inner circle, Joseph Stalin, who became the general secretary of the Communist Party in April. After experiencing poor health in 1921, Lenin suffered a stroke in May, second one in December. That month, Stalin took over personal control of Lenin's care, and he had access to him. A very ill Lenin dictated a final testament in which he famously urged his comrades to think about removing Stalin from his post. Eskimo pie. How many of you enjoy Eskimo pie? How many of you had Eskimo pie? It's ice cream. Iggly Gook ain't mad at nobody. Iggly Gook is eating that Eskimo pie. Eskimo pie was America's first chocolate-covered ice cream bar, invented by Christian Kent Nelson in his home laboratory in 1920. On January 24th, 1922, he patented his invention. By spring 2000, 700 manufacturers sold 1 million Eskimo pies a day. Is it billiards or pool? What's it called? Billiards or pool? Well, on September 1st, a new law went into effect in New York City. It required all pool rooms to change their names to billiard rooms or halls. The pool halls had to be closed by midnight. No one under 18 inside, and all tables had to have an unobstructed view. Oh, straw hats. Anybody wear a straw hat? There was a riot in New York. A straw hat riot. Do you know anything about it? Well, over the course of 8 days, beginning on September 13th, boys and men fought each other on the streets of New York City, resulting in injury, jail time, and general mayhem. In the early 1900s, straw hat season for men customarily began on May 15th, Straw Hat Day, and it ended on September 15th, Felt Hat Day. It was considered an etiquette violation to wear the wrong hat outside of these days. Gangs of teens and preteen boys began harassing boater-donning men and stealing or smashing their hats, or sometimes their skulls. These attacks and skirmishes went on for 8 days with mobs of hundreds on the street. Men fought back, and many of the youths brought to night court in front of the magistrate, Peter A. Hadding, Hadding and Hess goes together, who handed down fines and sometimes put people into jail. The legacy, there's the Charleston being danced in front of Capitol Hill. The flapper lifestyle and look would disappear in the Roaring '20s era, would come to a crashing end during the Wall Street crash in 1929. Women's sports growth also came to a halt. 1963, Betty Friedan released the book The Feminine Mystique, which referenced the flappers. The book was the start of the 1960s women's rights movement. Prohibition ended in 1933. Ku Klux Klan. KKK gained strength and faded away. Probably the most decisive factor in the Klan's fall in 1925 was because of a scandal. David C. Stevenson, who is the powerful Grand Cyclops of Indiana, whose power extended beyond Indiana into several Midwest states, abducted, raped, and murdered a young woman. There was a trial, he was sent to prison, and this begins the end of that Ku Klux Klan. Another Klan would come back in the 1950s and 60s during the Civil Rights Movement. No Nazis. Rockstock, Germany, no Nazis allowed in Germany. Nazi Party rose to power in 1932. Mussolini and Hitler became allies. Germany annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia in 1938. Germany invaded Poland September 1st, 1939. That started World War II. Japan bombed Pearl Harbor December 7th, 1941. The war ended in 1945. The Nazi Party has been outlawed in Germany. And here's Albert Fall. When the Teapot Dome affair became known, Congress directed Warren Harding to cancel the leases. The Supreme Court declared the leases fraudulent and ruled illegal Harding's transfer of authority to Albert Fall. Fall would take the fall. He accepted a bribe in the Elk Hills negotiations and was imprisoned. Edward Doheny and Harry Sinclair were acquitted of charges of bribery and criminal conspiracy, but Sinclair spent 6.5 months in prison for contempt of court and contempt of the U.S. Senate, although the Secretary of the Navy, Edwin Denby, had signed all the leases. He was cleared. Warren G. Harding is widely considered one of the worst presidents ever in American history because of the Teapot Dome scandal, and he was an adulterer. He had an illegitimate child in 1927. A best-selling memoir by Nan Britton claimed that she was his mistress and the mother of her daughter, illegitimate daughter. 2015 DNA testing revealed that Harding did have a daughter with Nan Britton. Harding did some good things. The country did come out of the recession in relatively good shape, advocated for labor reform, and laid the foundations for an 8-hour work week. Through multiple treaties during Harding's day, the naval arm race was slowed down. That is Will Hayes, despite being accused of rape and the murder of Virginia Rappe, Fatty Arbuckle, who was acquitted, was professionally ruined and unable to find steady work in films. In 1930, Will Hayes put moral clauses in performers' contracts, came up with do's and don'ts in terms of the movies. We're almost done here. The Straw Hat. Calvin Coolidge, Walter Johnson, Washington Senators. Calvin Coolidge wearing a straw hat. Straw hats faded from the scene by the mid-1920s. The ownership of Eskimo Pie has changed hands numerous times. Today, the ice cream bar is owned by Fornari, known as Eddie's Pie. Can't call it Eskimo Pie anymore. On October 2nd, 2020, Dreyer's Grand Ice Cream announced its Eskimo Pie ice cream bars would be rebranded, acknowledging in a statement that the ice cream name was derogatory. Change came in early 2021. It's still billiards in New York City. It's not a pool hall. It's billiards. Few remaining spots to shoot pool in New York City. There are very few of them, but it's billiard parlors. Technically, there are no pool halls in New York City. Any questions, any comments? It's your turn to talk. You're shaking your head. Why are you shaking your head?